So, you want to play Dungeons and Dragons. That's a bold move, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for you today on Bumbling Through Dungeons. So you've heard about this D&D thing, and maybe you're looking to play. Well, this video is designed to get you up and running. We're going to talk about what D&D is, what you can expect at the table, what kind of things you need to get started, and what kind of mentality is good to have as you approach your first play session. I'm going to jump off script a little bit when talking about D&D, and just to talk about what D&D is and what it is to me, or how I would describe it to a person who's about to play for the first time. And to me, what Dungeons & Dragons is a system for generating adventures and stories. So it is a very social experience. In some certain parts of society, I think D&D gets a little bit stigmatized, and it's seen as sort of this like nerdy antisocial hobby, and it's actually very much the opposite of that. You can't play D&D without having a social experience. It is very social, it's very collaborative, oftentimes very cooperative. I like to say that collaborative is not the same as cooperative. There can be antagonistic relationships at the table, but you're always collaborating together on the adventure and on the story. And if you talk to someone from Wizards of the Coast, the company who owns D&D and comes out with the official adventures, they might point you toward the 3 pillars of play. And what the 3 pillars are in D&D are the 3 things that you should expect to see in any game. There are a lot of different types of games that you can play in D&D, depending on your group, your DM, the setting that you're in, but there's going to be 3 elements that should be present in all of them. And that's combat, social interaction, and exploration. So combat kind of speaks for itself, and oftentimes it gets the brunt of the attention. And depending on your interest in the game, that could be a good or bad thing. So some groups tend more toward combat, where it's just one encounter after another with monsters and various creatures. Others will slow down a little bit in between those encounters, those combats, and they'll have more social interactions. There will be more role-playing in and amongst the group, or with your non-party characters that your dungeon master will be controlling. And the other 2, you should expect to interact socially with people within the game world. And again, these are people that your dungeon master will be controlling. And these are the people that you're going to be talking to as allies, as villains, as potential acquaintances. You might be investigating something. So anyone who populates the world, there's going to be a lot of that goes on within the game. And lastly, exploration. Of course, you're going to be exploring. Usually when we think of exploring, we think of the wilderness, the mountains and the forests and subterranean caverns, and that's certainly a part of a lot of D&D adventures. But you can also have exploration in urban environments. You can be at sea. You can be in different types of civilizations. You can be on different planes of existence. It can get pretty nutty in a hurry with things of that nature, since it is, at its core, a fantasy universe with a lot going on with gods and planar deities and different entities that create these sort of unique situations. So one of the things that I find that people think about D&D that isn't necessarily true is that it's always set in a fantasy universe. This is true of most D&D games, I would say, or a lot of them at least, and the sort of standard setting for D&D adventures that most of them are set in is your standard Tolkien-esque or Game of Thrones-esque fantasy universe. So that's where a lot of it is going to take place, but that's not the only type of game and type of setting that you can experience in D&D. I always throw people for a loop when I say that you can set D&D in space. Now, for people who are familiar with these settings that are actually in space, this might not be something out of the ordinary, but for people whose introduction to Dungeons & Dragons and all they know about it comes from pop culture, a lot of what they know is the Dungeons and the Dragons and the things adjacent to that within a fantasy setting, within sort of a generic fantasy setting. So there are alternate settings for D&D in which you can run games. So if you're more into the sci-fi side of things, if you like steampunk or noir settings or post-apocalyptic or Arabian Nights style settings. I'm running a few of these off the top of my head, but these are all defined settings that exist within D&D outside of the sort of classic fantasy genre. And yes, there is one in space as well. So you can have an entire campaign set in space, still using the same rule system that defines all of D&D. So I think the takeaway there is, if the fantasy elements are what's kept you away, just start to talk to some people and talk to them about what your interests are and what type of setting, what type of campaign, what type of adventure might appeal to you most. And chances are you're going to be able to find some other people who are excited about that as well. And you can find an adventure to run or play in that's a little bit off the beaten path in terms of what genre it falls into. So, what do you need to play? Well, the answer is, perhaps surprisingly to some, not very much. So to get started in D&D, you don't really need much at all. In the description below this video, I'm going to link to the standard rules document. That is basically just the basic rules for D&D. It's not quite as robust as the player's handbook, but it's enough to get you started on the game, enough to understand the basics and create a character and to start to play. If you're going to be playing on regular occasions, so it's going to be more than once that you're playing, I would recommend getting the player's handbook and reading it cover to cover. That's really the best way to learn the game and figure out what it's all about. But the basic rules that I've linked down in the description, those are available for free from Wizards of the Coast. That's really all that you need. So if you bring a set of dice, a pencil, and a character sheet to your first session of D&D, you're set, and you won't have had to spend any money on rule books or miniatures or all kind of fancy supplements and add-ons. You can go pretty far down the rabbit hole of buying different things to add to your gaming experience, but really the core of D&D is what happens at the table, and you don't need a lot of stuff for that. So a lot of it just happens up here. It happens in the theater of the mind between you, the other players, and your dungeon master. And then I also get questions about the time commitment. People will hear that I'm running a campaign or playing in a campaign, and you'll see their brow furrow, and they'll say, well, that's a lot of time. I don't have that kind of time. And that might be true for you, and so D&D might be something that you only play every now and then. But what I've found is, relative to a lot of other hobbies that I've been a part of in my life, D&D doesn't take any more time out of my day, week, month, year than a lot of other things that I'm involved in. Sessions are normally going to take between 3 and 4 hours, I would say is standard. You might find some shorter sessions that run closer to 2 hours, and on the longer side you might find some that run 5 or so hours with breaks in between. But that's really 90% or more of the sessions that you join are going to fall within that range and be somewhere in the 3 to 4 hour range. And depending on what kind of group that you form up, you might be meeting once a week, you might be meeting every other week, you might be meeting once a month. It might just be something that you want to try out. And so you just meet whenever you have the time, and you're not playing a campaign where it's coherent from one session to the next. You might just be playing a series of one-shots where it's a self-contained adventure, and then if you don't show up for the next one, you don't miss a part of the ongoing story. So that can be an easy way for a lot of people to jump in and start to play without having to commit too fully to it just yet. I'm also going to link to something called the Adventurers League down in the description. Adventurers League is a community play system that's received a lot of support in this current edition of D&D from Wizards of the Coast. So through Adventurers League, you can find meetup groups throughout the area that will play the adventures that Wizards of the Coast has created for Adventurers League. You can keep your same character, and while it might not be a coherent story that follows an A to B to C to D storyline, you can still play with a lot of the same people at the same place with the same character. But then if you have to miss a certain week or certain month or whenever the meetups are, it's not as big a deal because people are coming and going. So this is what's called an open table. And a lot of these, you'll have a certain number of dungeon masters running games, and you either sign up beforehand or people can just show up and join a game. Adventurers League is a great way to try out D&D, see how you like it, learn some of the rules. It's also a nice way to dip your toe in the water without saying, I'm going to play a full campaign first. The downside of Adventurers League is that oftentimes you're not going to know the people that you're playing with. So if you start to go to the same place over and over again, you'll probably run with the same dungeon master. You'll probably play with a lot of the same players eventually. But especially when you're starting out, you won't necessarily know the people that you're going to be playing with. And this can be a little bit different because you're learning play styles while you're learning the game. So there's pros and cons to it, but it is a nice way for people who don't have a dedicated game group that want to get started in D&D. So hopefully that covers how you can get started playing D&D, what kind of things you need to know, and where you can find groups to meet up with. The last thing that I want to talk about is the mentality that I think is good to have going into your first session, and really to a large extent throughout your gaming in D&D, not just the first or second time. There is a social contract, I would call it, between you and the other players, as well as between you and your dungeon master. And sometimes this social contract is unspoken. Other times, dungeon masters will make it explicit at the table and they'll go over rules of etiquette, things of that nature. But it's basically just a social contract of mutual respect. So in practice, mutual respect just means, one, show up on time, prepared to play. It doesn't mean you need to know all of the rules or all of your character mechanics, especially when you're learning. Part of that social contract also states that, hey, you'll help other players as they're learning, so as not to make them feel uncomfortable or unwanted at the table. Oftentimes, too, the dungeon master has put in a lot of work, a lot of preparation to craft an adventure that's going to be very fun for the players at the table. So that respect extends to the dungeon master, and it basically states that I understand that you've put a lot of work into this. I'm going to respect that and give it my all here at the table to help everyone have a fun experience. In return, the dungeon master should expect that the players should have their own agency, and the DM is trying to create an environment where the players can have fun as well. So if everyone's working toward that same goal, you're more likely to have a really good experience. And if I'm doing an elevator pitch for D&D, if somebody asks me what it is, I just say it's collaborative storytelling. So in those two words, I think it encapsulates a lot of why I play D&D and a lot of what I see at the table. There are multiple different reasons that you might come to a D&D table to play, and a lot of different ways that you can enjoy the game. But at its core, you're collaborating together to tell a story, or to tell an adventure. I guess tell a story just sounds better. I don't know. Tell an adventure, to live an adventure, that works. To live an adventure, to experience an adventure, that's better. All right. And as I said earlier in the video, collaborating is not necessarily cooperating, but you don't want to be too terribly antagonistic at the table, because you always want to remember that you are working together to create this story, to experience this adventure. So there will be times where your character's motivations conflict with those of someone else at the table. There will be moments of tension like this, and that can be a great thing at the table. But even when there is that tension, even when there is that disagreement, you're still working together to create that story out of that tension. So if you go in with that mentality, I do think you'll have a great experience. Of course, there are caveats to this. You can go on the internet and find horror stories of people that showed up at game shops to play or started a new campaign and things just didn't go well. These things do happen. It's not always going to be a great experience. But in my experience, if you come to the table with that mentality, it's going to make it much easier to work together with everyone at the table and really to have a blast every time you sit down at the table to play. And lastly, if you have any questions about table etiquette, about what you should be doing, about what you can do when you're playing, about what your character can do, character questions, always communicate with your dungeon master. So this is true of campaigns as well. It's not just at the beginning when you're sort of establishing rules and ground rules for the session or the campaign. Really throughout your D&D experience, for as long as you play, as things come up that you haven't encountered before, situations or questions, talk to your dungeon master. So that should be an open communication between DMs and players so that everyone is on the same page at each stage during a campaign. I've found that the more you do this, the more you keep those lines of communication open, the easier it is to just sit down and play when you're at the table, because you don't have to work out certain rules that you might be using or certain aspects of the setting or game world that you're in. So the more that you handle outside of the game, just communicating with your DM, the smoother your experience is going to be. Again, if you're playing with someone for the first time that you've never met, this is going to be a little bit different, but always feel free to ask for clarification at the table if you don't understand how they're handling something. All right, that's it. If you have other questions for me, please put them down in the comments. Otherwise, if you haven't played D&D yet and you're going into your first time, good luck. I hope you have a blast, and we'll see you next time.